Roman historians was a major battle fought between an alliance of Germanic peoples and the Roman Empire between 8 and 11 September 9 AD, possibly near modern Kalkriese. Fighting began with an ambush by the Germanic alliance on 3 Roman legions being led by Publius Quinctilius Varus and their auxiliaries. The alliance was led by Arminius, a Germanic chieftain and officer of Varus's auxilia. Arminius had received Roman citizenship and a Roman military education, thus allowing him to deceive the Romans methodically and anticipate their tactical responses. Teutoburg Forest is considered one of the most important defeats in Roman history, bringing the triumphant period of expansion under Augustus to an abrupt end. It dissuaded the Romans from pursuing the conquest of Germania, and so can be considered one of the most important events in European history. The provinces of Germania Superior and Germania Inferior, sometimes referred to as Roman Germania, were established in northeast Roman Gaul, while territories beyond the Rhine remained independent. Retaliatory campaigns were commanded by Tiberius and Germanicus and enjoyed success, but the Rhine became the border between the Roman Empire and the rest of Germania. Rome then made no major incursion into Germania until Marcus Aurelius, 161 to 180 AD, during the Marcomannic Wars. Some of the descendants of the vassal kingdoms, like the Suebi by suzerainty that Augustus tried to create in Germania to expand the Romanitas and the empire, were the ones that invaded Rome in the 4th and 5th centuries. The Roman Republic expanded rapidly in the 1st century BC, most notably under Julius Caesar, who conquered most of Western Europe and parts of the British Isles in the Gallic Wars, 58 to 50 BC. These mostly were against the Gauls, but also included battles with various Germanic tribes. Caesar twice crossed the Rhine River, but the engagements were inconclusive. His conquests ended as Caesar's civil war, 49 to 45 BC, drew near. Continental Europe was mostly neglected by Rome for the next 2 decades as power struggles racked the Republic. Troops previously garrisoned in Gaul were pulled out in 31 BC for the showdown between Octavian and Mark Antony at the Battle of Actium. The Gauls promptly rebelled, and Roman control was not regained until 28 BC. 27 BC saw drastic change for both Gaul and Rome as a whole. The Roman Republic reorganized into the Roman Empire with Octavian the first emperor. Augustus, now styled Augustus, aimed to solidify control of Gaul by dividing the region into 3 smaller provinces that emphasized the strategic importance of the Rhine Valley. Troops were kept near the Rhine, though policy towards the Germanic lands remains unclear. 2 theories exist. The first is that Augustus simply sought to cement the Rhine as the northern border of the empire. The second, that the border was far more fluid, and that the troops were focused on maintaining order in the empire more than on preventing Germanic intrusion. The Germanics operated with apparent impunity anyway, as exemplified by the crushing defeat in the Lolian disaster in 16 BC. The Lolian disaster prompted a reorganization of the legions in Gaul, which was completed by 12 BC, when Augustus sought finally to tame the Germanic tribes. He began by making his stepson Drusus I governor of Gaul. Drusus campaigned against the Germanics from 11 to 9 BC, earning a series of victories despite considerable obstacles before his untimely death in a riding accident in 9 BC. His elder brother and future emperor Tiberius I was given command of Germany in 8 BC. Tiberius continued his brother's campaign against the Sugamberi, extending de facto if not de jure Roman rule, but he fell out of political favor and chose exile in 6 BC. He, in turn, was succeeded by Lucius Domitius Anobarbus, who had been consul in 16 BC. Anobarbus suppressed a number of local uprisings and then crossed the Elbe River, the first and last Roman general to do so. As the turn of the century approached, the Romans felt secure about Germany, reassured by thriving cross-border trade and relative peace. In early AD 6, Legatus Gaius Sentius Saturninus and consul Legatus Marcus Aemilius Lepidus led a massive army of 13 legions and their entourage, totaling around 100,000 men, 65,000 heavy infantry legionaries, 10,000 to 20,000 cavalrymen, archers, and 10,000 to 20,000 civilians against Maroboduus, the king of the Marcomanni,
who were a tribe of the Suebi.
However, Tiberius was then forced to turn his attention to the Bellum Battonianum, also known as the Great Illyrian Revolt, which broke out in the Balkan province of Illyricum. Led by Bato the Decidiate, Bato the Brutian, Pins of Pannonia, and elements of the Marcomanni, it lasted nearly 4 years. Tiberius had to stop his campaign against Maroboduus and recognize him as king, so that he could then send 8 legions, Augusta, 15 Apollinaris, 20 Valeria Victrix, 21 Rapax, 13 Gemina, 14 Gemina, 16 Gallica, and an unknown unit to crush the rebellion in the Balkans. After his return from Rome to Gaul, Arminius became a trusted advisor to Varus, the governor of the newly created Roman province of Germania, even as he secretly constructed an alliance of Germanic peoples that had traditionally been enemies. These probably included the Cherusci, Marsi, Chatti, and Bructeri. These were some of the 50 Germanic tribes at the time. Using the collective outrage over Varus's tyranny, insolence, and cruelty to the conquered, Arminius was able to unite the disorganized groups who had submitted to Rome and maintain the alliance until the most opportune moment to strike. Following Rome's transfer of forces to the Balkans, only 3 legions faced the Germanic tribesmen. This was the opportunity for Arminius to defeat Varus. While Varus was on his way from his summer camp west of the river Weser to winter quarters near the Rhine, he heard reports of a local rebellion. These had been fabricated by Arminius. Edward Shepherd Creasy writes that this was represented to Varus as an occasion which required his prompt attendance on the spot, but he was kept in studied ignorance of its being part of a concerted national rising, and he still looked at Arminius as his submissive vassal. The Varian disaster takes its name from Publius Quinctilius Varus, the Roman commander. Varus was a promising leader. Emperor Augustus appointed him quaestor in 22 BC as a young man, even though the office usually required the holder to be at least 30. He went on to command the 19 Legion in 15 BC and was elected junior consul. He was appointed governor of Africa in 8 BC and of Syria in 7 BC. The Syrian posting was prestigious and a very difficult job due to political struggles in the Eastern Empire and its border nations. Varus acted to resolve the succession crisis at the death of Herod the Great in 4 BC, but his performance as governor is disputed by contemporary sources. Josephus, writing some decades after the fact, has a positive view of Varus, whereas Velleius Paterculus implicitly accuses him of corruption. Regardless, Varus married the emperor's great-niece after his term as governor ended, which ensured him a place in the emperor's inner circle. Varus likely remained with the emperor in Rome until his appointment to the command in Germania in 7 AD. Michael McNally assesses that Varus was not assigned to Germania for his military abilities, but for his political acumen. This was likely sought by the emperor to deal with the factionalism among Germanic tribes. Varus's name and deeds were known beyond the empire because of his ruthlessness, including crucifixion of insurgents. While he was feared by the people, he was highly respected by the Roman Senate. On the Rhine, he was in command of the 17th, 18th, and 19th legions. These had previously been led by General Gaius Sentius Saturninus, who had been sent back to Rome after being awarded the Ornamenta Triumphalia. The other 2 legions in the winter quarters of the army at Castrum Moguntium were led by Varus's nephew, Lucius Nonius Aspranus, and perhaps Lucius Aruntius. Varus initially commanded 5 legions plus auxiliaries. In the early imperial period, each legion at full strength had 4,800 men supported by 120 light escort or scouting cavalry. Combined usually with a group of engineers and officers, a legion was roughly 5,000 fighting men. This did not include the 1,200 non-combatant servants who were integrated into the legion. Varus's initial command of about 25,000, not counting auxiliaries, represented some 20% of the Roman frontline army, but it is unclear how many men were truly under his command at the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. Estimates generally range between 20,000 and 30,000. Of his 5 starting legions, only 3 were under his command at the battle, about 15,000 men, supported by 9 small auxiliary units, about 4,500 men. Winter attrition due to casualties, illness, and other causes would have sapped the legion's strength. The Roman historian Cassius Dio assumed that a large number of civilians were part of the camp following, but McNally finds this unlikely. Recent reforms had required that legionaries be unmarried, which meant that families were no longer part of the camp following. McNally puts the likely number of civilians at a few hundred, mostly merchants who followed the army. Assuming 10% winter attrition and an auxiliary force of about 4,000 after attrition, McNally comes up with 17,000 combatants, supported by roughly 3,800 servant non-combatants. Combined with the civilians, the army would have numbered about 21,000 at the start of campaigning, but was probably smaller by the time of the battle, as further attrition combined with the need to detach garrisons along the way would have sapped the army's strength. The main Roman army was highly professional and outfitted by the state. They were given standardized weapons and armor consisting of a gladius, a short sword, a pilum, a javelin, a helmet, a mail shirt, and some segmented armor. The auxiliary units were not outfitted by the Romans and instead would have represented the equipment and fighting styles of their homelands, which put them much on par with the Germanic troops. The Germanic coalition was led by Arminius of the Cherusci tribe. Arminius was in a strong position to understand Roman tactics and strategy. Even though he was born in Germania, he was taken hostage by the Romans after Drusus defeated the tribe in combat in 8 BC, when Arminius would have been about 10 years old. He received an aristocratic education in Rome, as he was the son of a nobleman, even if he was still a hostage. When he came of age, he joined the Ordo Equester, the Roman cavalry, which would later lead to his appointment as a commander of Roman auxiliaries. By 4 AD, he was serving in Pannonia, in the northwestern Balkan states. Soon after, he returned to his homeland in Germania, still nominally loyal to Rome. McNally suggests that 2 important events shaped Arminius's view of the Romans: an ambush in 11 BC led by the Cherusci against Drusus, and Drusus's victory over the Cherusci in 8 BC. In the ambush in 11 BC, the Cherusci had trapped Drusus's army in unfavorable terrain, and the Romans escaped only with great difficulty. Drusus's victory in 8 BC would have been unforgettable to Arminius, who had been made a hostage because of it. From these events, McNally argues that Arminius surmised a key lesson. The Romans could be defeated, but only in a situation where their tactical flexibility and discipline could not be brought on bear. The size of Arminius's forces is a guessing game at best, since no written records of the Germanic peoples survive. Estimates thus vary widely based on the starting assumptions. Historian Adrian Murdoch suggests a force of 25,000. Historian Peter Wells suggests that the army may have pulled from a large area and gives a range between 17,000 and 100,000, but suggests that 18,000 were probably involved at the final stage of the battle when the Romans were routed. McNally finds fault with Wells's demographic calculation style, finding his upper estimate of 100,000 to be very unlikely. Historian Hans Delbruck suggested that each tribe involved probably had 6,000 to 8,000 fighting men, for a total in the 20,000 to 30,000 range.
Delbruck notes that these troops were not just mere farmers, they were experienced soldiers in their own right, even if not outfitted by the state as the Romans were. But the Germanic army was generally worse outfitted than the Romans. Most had no armor and would have been limited to a simple shield and a hunting spear or axe. There was a gradation in equipment quality according to the wealth and status of the fighter. Those fighters who would have held command roles or been part of a chief's guard would have carried a heavy spear and a number of javelins, along with various other secondary weapons, as well as high-quality shields. Still, armor was very rare and would have been acquired as spoils of war from defeated Romans or perhaps from time serving as a Roman auxiliary. Ancient battles were constrained by the seasons and weather. Typically, the campaigning season began in March and ended by October, at which point armies would return to winter camps. Over the winter of 8 to 9 AD, Varus planned the simple campaign for the coming year. The disparate elements of the army would meet at Vetra, modern-day Xanten, Germany, cross the Rhine, march to Cherusci territory while resupplying garrisons on the way, and then set up a summer camp in nominally pacified Cherusci lands from which to base summer operations. But unbeknownst to Varus, he had already been betrayed. The idea of setting up a summer camp in Cherusci lands was a ploy by Arminius, who was still Varus's trusted confidant. By being in the homeland of Arminius, the Cherusci could carefully observe the Romans during the summer, and the Romans would have to make a longer trek back to their winter headquarters. Then, while on the long march back, the Romans could be ambushed in terrain favorable to Arminius. It is unknown as to when Arminius decided to plan an attack against Rome and its forces. It could have occurred during his time as a youth during his Romanization as a hostage, or even as late as his service in Germania under Varus. Regardless, his mind was made up by early 9 AD when he began deceiving Varus and recruiting Germanic leaders and warriors to his cause. It is doubtful that Arminius imagined he would strike a total victory against the Romans, and thus he had to build a coalition of tribes together in order to wage what could have been a protracted war. The Roman army moved out of winter camps sometime in March and followed Varus's plan. Logistical challenges beset the army and security was lax. The location of the summer camp is unknown, but probably near or at what is now Minden, Germany. Historical sources suggest that Varus waged little to no military action that summer and instead focused on holding court and dealing with the Germanic tribes in a political and legal sense. McNally finds the accounts to be unreliable on some points, noting that the only contemporary chronicler who describes the summer was Paterculus, and that Paterculus had reason to dislike Varus. Other accounts, in turn, relied on Paterculus's account, and thus had Paterculus's bias. At any rate, the summer was probably typical for the troops, whose time would have been spent drilling or engaging in civil engineering projects such as strengthening local roads and fortifications. The summer proved crucial for Arminius, who, along with his auxiliaries, was attached to the main Roman army. He bided his time during the early part of the summer, but the clock was running out, and he still needed to orchestrate an ambush. Thus, in July, he ordered some of his allies to start raiding the Romans. Then he counseled Varus to split off a detachment of troops to go put down unrest. Varus acceded, thereby splitting his own forces. Arminius further arranged for his own Cherusci auxiliaries to find Roman work parties, approach them as if nothing was unusual, and then betray the Romans while in their midst. McNally chastises Varus for not improving security or otherwise realizing that a larger plan was afoot. Arminius's carefully laid plans nearly unraveled when his father-in-law, Segestes, informed Varus of Arminius's treachery. But Varus disbelieved this report, perhaps because Segestes had not approved of the marriage of his daughter and thus bore a grudge against Arminius. As late summer arrived, escalating unrest became the chief concern. Other counselors to Varus advised that there was not enough time left in the season to put down unrest and also make it back to winter camp. An early Roman retreat back to camp would have foiled Arminius's plans, as the Romans would not only leave before the Germanic troops could be marshaled, but the Romans would also retreat along the same well-guarded path they had come in on. In a desperate gamble, Arminius suggested that instead of retracing the army's path, they could achieve both goals if they went on campaign against the Angrivari. By going through Angrivari territory, the route back would be shorter, and the Romans would also be able to put down the revolt. The otherwise boring summer may have increased Varus's willingness to engage in action, and he chose to follow Arminius's plan. On the morning of September 9, 9 AD, the Roman army mustered to move out. The muster was combined with the third payday of the year, which resulted in large numbers of coins being distributed to the army. The high density of coins would, some 2,000 years later, serve as an archaeological marker of the battle site.